The message came just after 9:40 p.m., lighting up the quiet living room with a soft, familiar glow. She didn't think twice when she reached for her phone. She rarely did. Mark noticed. He didn't say anything at first. He was sitting across from her, reading, glasses low on his nose, flipping through the same page of a book he hadn't really been reading for the past 10 minutes. His eyes had drifted up the moment her screen lit up. Not sharply, not suspiciously, just attentively. "Late for work messages, isn't it?" he asked, his tone calm, almost casual. She glanced up, half smiling. "It's just Brian. We've got that client presentation next week. He overthinks everything." Mark nodded slowly, like he was filing the information away somewhere private. "Right," he said. That could have been the end of it. And maybe it should have been. But something in the way he said "right" lingered longer than the word itself. She didn't notice. Or maybe she chose not to. After 22 years of marriage, silence had become a language of its own between them. Not the kind that felt empty, but the kind that felt settled, familiar. Their children had both moved out within the past 3 years. The house that once echoed with noise now carried a quieter rhythm. Mornings were slower. Evenings stretched longer. Conversations had fewer interruptions, but also fewer surprises. She had grown comfortable in that space. Comfortable in knowing exactly who Mark was, and what their life looked like. There were no sudden storms in their marriage. No loud arguments. No slamming doors. Just steady ground. And steady ground, she had always believed, didn't need to be questioned. Brian had joined the firm about 8 months earlier. First, he was just another name in meetings. Another face at the conference table. But he had a way of making himself known, not by being loud, but by being present. He listened carefully. He remembered small details. He laughed easily, the kind of laugh that made others feel like they were part of something. The first real conversation they had was during a late afternoon at the office, when most people had already left. She had been reviewing documents, shoulders tense from hours of staring at the screen, when Brian had walked past her desk. "You always stay this late?" he had asked. She shrugged, not looking up. "Someone has to fix what everyone else leaves behind." He chuckled softly. "Or maybe you just don't trust anyone else to do it right." That made her look up. There was no edge in his voice. No judgment. Just an easy observation. "Maybe," she admitted. From there, the conversations came naturally. First it was just work, deadlines, clients, strategies. But slowly, without any clear moment of transition, it became more. He'd stop by her desk for quick chats. Send her articles he thought she'd find interesting. Share small jokes that only the two of them seemed to understand. Felt harmless. It was harmless, she told herself. "Does he text you often?" Mark asked one evening about 2 weeks after that first late-night message. They were in the kitchen this time. She was rinsing dishes, her hands moving automatically under the running water. He paused just slightly. "Sometimes. Work stuff mostly." Mark leaned against the counter, arms crossed loosely. "Mostly." She turned off the faucet, drying her hands slowly. "Mark, it's nothing. We're working on a big project together. That's all." "I'm not saying it's something," he replied, his voice steady. "I'm just asking." There was no accusation in his tone. No sharpness. If anything, it was almost too calm. And that irritated her more than it should have. "You're overthinking it," she said, a little more firmly than she intended. Mark didn't react immediately. He just watched her for a moment. His expression unreadable. "Maybe," he said finally. But again, something in the way he said it stayed behind, long after the conversation ended. She told herself it was nothing. 'Cause it felt like nothing. Brian wasn't inappropriate. He didn't cross any lines. He was friendly, respectful, engaging. And if his messages came a little more often than necessary, well, that was just how some people were. Not everyone had to be like Mark. Quiet, reserved, careful with words. Some people were just open. "Rough day." Brian asked one afternoon, leaning casually against the edge of her desk. She sighed, rubbing her temples. Client pushed the deadline up again. Apparently, everything is urgent now. He winced sympathetically. Of course it is. That's their favorite word. She smiled faintly. I swear one of these days, I'm just going to stop answering emails after 6. You should, he said. You deserve a life outside this place. She let out a soft laugh. Tell that to my inbox. I'm serious, he added, his tone shifting slightly. You do a lot more than anyone here notices. Something about that landed differently. Not because it was extraordinary, but because it felt seen. She nodded, brushing it off lightly. Comes with the job. But the comment stayed with her longer than she expected. Home, things remain the same. Dinner together. Quiet conversations. Occasional laughter. But there were small moments, subtle, almost invisible shifts, that began to appear. She'd check her phone more often. Sometimes smile at messages she didn't explain. Sometimes drift slightly out of conversations, just for a second. Mark noticed all of it. Not in a way that accused, but in a way that observed. You seem distracted lately, he said one night, as they sat side by side on the couch. She blinked, pulling her attention back. What do you mean? He gestured vaguely. Just here and not here at the same time. She exhaled, a hint of impatience creeping in. It's work, Mark. Things are busy right now. He nodded slowly. I get that. But he didn't look convinced. And for the first time, she felt a flicker of defensiveness rise inside her. I'm handling it, she added. I know you are, he said. Again calm. Always calm. And somehow, that calmness made it easier to dismiss him. Because if he had been angry, if he had accused her, if he had raised his voice, maybe she would have taken it seriously. But he didn't. He just noticed. And she just ignored. The messages kept coming. The conversations grew longer. And the line between just work and something more began to blur. So slowly. She didn't even realize it was happening. The shift didn't happen all at once. If it had, she might have seen it for what it was. Instead, it came quietly, woven into ordinary days, hidden inside routine conversations, disguised as harmless familiarity. Brian didn't suddenly become different. He simply became closer. Started with small things. Messages that weren't strictly about work. Long day. Did you ever get a break today? Don't forget to eat something. They were simple, thoughtful even. The kind of messages that didn't raise alarms, just softened the edges of a busy day. First she responded politely, briefly. But over time her replies grew longer, warmer. Not intentionally, just naturally. One evening, as she sat at the dining table going through documents, her phone buzzed again. Still working? Brian had asked. She glanced at the clock. Nearly 10:15. Yeah. Trying to finish this before tomorrow. A few seconds passed. Then, you work too hard. She smiled faintly. Someone has to. Another pause. Then his reply came, slower this time. Does anyone take care of you? Her fingers hovered over the screen. It was an odd question. Not inappropriate. Not exactly. Just different. She typed back, keeping it light. I manage. She didn't mention Mark. She didn't think she needed to. Across the room, Mark looked up from his chair. Everything okay? He asked. She nodded without looking at him. Yeah. Just finishing something. He studied her for a moment, then returned to his book. But again he wasn't really reading. At work, the dynamic continued to shift. Brian began stopping by her office more often, even when there was no clear reason. Sometimes he'd sit across from her just talking about work, about life, about things that had nothing to do with either. He had a way of making conversations feel easy, enforced, like they had been happening for years. You ever think about doing something different? He asked one afternoon, leaning back in the chair opposite her desk. She looked up, slightly surprised. Different how? I don't know, he said, shrugging. Something that actually excites you. Not just this. She frowned faintly. This is my job. Yeah, he said. But is it what you want? The question lingered longer than it should have. She had never really asked herself that. Not in a long time. I don't know, she admitted. Brian smiled, not in a triumphant way, but in a knowing one. That's an honest answer. That evening, she found herself quieter than usual. Mark noticed. You're thinking about something, he said gently, setting his cup down on the table. She hesitated, then shrugged. Just work stuff. He tilted his head slightly. That's not all. She looked at him, a flicker of irritation rising again. Why does it have to be more than that? It doesn't, he said calmly. I'm just asking. There it was again. That same calm tone. That same quiet observation. And again she dismissed it. Brian's messages became more frequent. More personal. He started sharing things about his own life. His past relationships, his frustrations, his ambitions. He spoke openly, almost effortlessly. And slowly, without realizing it, she began doing the same. Not everything, but more than she should have. You're easy to talk to, he told her one afternoon. She smiled politely. I've been told that before. No, he said, shaking his head slightly. I mean it. You actually listen. That's rare. She looked down at her desk, unsure how to respond. Compliments had never been something she relied on. But this one stayed with her. At home, Mark's questions didn't stop. They didn't increase in intensity. They didn't become confrontational. They simply continued. Quiet. Consistent. Does he ever talk about anything other than work? Mark asked one night. She sighed, setting her phone down a little harder than necessary. Mark, what is this about? He met her gaze, steady and calm. I'm just trying to understand. There's nothing to understand, she said firmly. He's a colleague. That's it. Mark nodded slowly. I believe you, he said. But there was something in his eyes that suggested he was seeing something she wasn't. And that made her uncomfortable. Because deep down, there was a part of her that knew things had shifted. Not in a dramatic way. Not in a way that felt wrong. Just enough to notice. And that was the part she avoided looking at too closely. The turning point didn't come with a dramatic build-up. Came quietly. Like everything else. It was late afternoon when Brian asked if she could stay a little longer after work. Just need to go over a few things, he said. She hesitated for a moment, then agreed. It didn't seem unusual. They had stayed late before. The office was nearly empty by the time they finished. The lights were dimmer. The usual noise replaced by a soft, distant hum. She gathered her things ready to leave when Brian spoke again. Can I ask you something? She looked up. Sure. He hesitated. For the first time since she had known him, he seemed unsure. Do you ever feel like... He paused, searching for the right words. Like there's something more between people than what they say out loud? Her stomach tightened slightly. It was an unexpected question. And suddenly, the room felt quieter than before. I'm not sure what you mean, she said carefully. Brian stepped a little closer. Not too close, but closer than usual. I think you do, he said softly. Her heartbeat quickened just slightly. Brian, I know you're married, he interrupted gently. I respect that. I really do. There was a pause. Long one. But I also know what I feel, he added. The words settled heavily in the space between them. Clear. Unavoidable. And in that moment, everything she had ignored, everything she had dismissed, everything Mark had quietly noticed, came rushing into focus all at once. This wasn't harmless. It hadn't been for a while. She took a step back. No, she said, her voice firmer than she expected. That's not what this is. Brian didn't argue. He just looked at her, something unreadable in his expression. Maybe not for you, he said quietly. The words lingered long after she left the office. The drive home felt longer than usual, heavier. Her mind replayed every conversation, every message, every moment she had brushed aside. And for the first time, she saw them clearly. Mark had seen it before she did. Not because he was suspicious, but because he was outside of it. When she walked through the front door, Mark was in the living room, waiting. Not anxiously, not angrily, just there. He looked up as she entered, and in that moment, she realized something she hadn't fully understood before. He hadn't been questioning her. He had been trying to protect something. Something she hadn't realized was at risk. She took a slow breath. "Mark," she said. Her voice was quieter now. Different. "I need to tell you something." Mark didn't move right away. He didn't interrupt her. He didn't ask questions. He simply closed the book in his hands, set it aside, and gave her his full attention. It was a small gesture, but it carried weight. The kind of weight that made it impossible to look away from the truth. She stood there for a moment, unsure where to begin. Not because she didn't know what had happened, but because she didn't know how to explain something she hadn't fully understood herself until now. "It wasn't what you think," she said at first, almost instinctively. Then she stopped. "'Cause that wasn't right. Not anymore." She shook her head slightly. "No, that's not it." Mark waited. Still calm. Still steady. "He told me today," she continued, her voice quieter now. "Brian," he said. "He feels like there's something between us." The words felt heavier out loud. More real. More undeniable. Mark's expression didn't change. Not immediately. He just absorbed what she said the way he always did. Carefully, without rushing to respond. "And is there?" he asked. The question wasn't sharp. It wasn't defensive. It was honest. She shook her head quickly. "No, there isn't. At least, not in the way he thinks." She paused, her thoughts catching up with her words. "But I think I let things get closer than they should have." That part was harder to say. Because it meant acknowledging something she had spent weeks dismissing. Mark nodded slowly. Not in agreement. Not in disappointment. Just understanding. "He's been messaging more," she went on. "Talking about things that weren't work. Asking questions. Saying things that felt normal at the time." She let out a quiet breath. "I didn't think anything of it." Mark's gaze remained steady. "And now?" She hesitated. "Now I see it," she admitted. "I see where it was going. I just didn't want to look at it before." There was a silence between them then. But it wasn't empty. It was full of everything that hadn't been said over the past few weeks. "I should have listened to you," she added, her voice softer now. Mark leaned back slightly, exhaling. "I wasn't trying to be right," he said. "I was just trying to understand what I was seeing." She looked at him, really looked this time. There was no anger in his face. No frustration. Just a quiet kind of clarity. "Why didn't you say it more directly?" she asked. It wasn't an accusation. It was a genuine question. Mark considered that for a moment. "Because I trust you," he said simply. "And I didn't want to turn something into a problem if it wasn't one." He paused, then added, "But I also didn't want to ignore something that felt off." She swallowed hard. "That's exactly what I did," she said. "I ignored it." Mark shook his head slightly. "You didn't ignore it. You just didn't see it the same way I did." The difference mattered. More than she had realized before. "I thought you were overthinking," she admitted. "I know," he said. "And you weren't," she added quietly. Mark didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice was calm, but firm in a way she hadn't heard before. "It wasn't about him," he said. "It was about us." That landed deeper than anything else. "I wasn't worried about you doing something wrong," he continued. "I was worried about something slowly crossing a line without you realizing it." He met her gaze again. "Because that's usually how it happens." She nodded slowly. "'Cause now." She understood exactly what he meant. I stopped it, she said. As soon as he said it. I told him no. That there's nothing there. That there won't ever be. Mark held her gaze for a moment, then nodded. I figured you would. There it was again. That quiet confidence. Not blind trust. But something deeper. Something built over years. I should have said something sooner, she added. Maybe, Mark said. Or maybe you needed to see it for yourself. She let that sit for a moment. Because there was truth in it. Uncomfortable but clear. What happens now? He asked. The question wasn't heavy. It was practical. Grounded. I'll keep things professional, she said. Strictly work. No more messages outside of that. No more conversations that aren't necessary. She paused, then added. I'll make it clear. Mark nodded once. That sounds reasonable. There was no demand in his response. No conditions. Just trust. I don't want this to change anything between us, she said quietly. Mark looked at her, something softer in his expression now. It doesn't have to, he replied. Another silence followed. But this one felt different. Lighter. Not because everything was fixed, but because everything was finally clear. Later that night, as they sat side by side again, the house felt the same. And yet something had shifted. Not in a way that broke anything, but in a way that revealed something that had always been there. Awareness. She glanced at Mark, watching him as he turned a page in his book. For the first time in weeks, she noticed something she had overlooked. The way he paid attention. The way he observed quietly. The way he spoke carefully. Not to control but to protect. It had never been about suspicion. It had never been about doubt. It had been about perspective. And she had been too close to see it. The next day at work she kept her distance. Not cold. Not unfriendly. Just clear. Defined. When Brian approached her desk, his expression was neutral, but his eyes carried the memory of the conversation they had shared. Morning, he said. Morning, she replied. Her tone was polite. Professional. Nothing more. The conversation stayed brief. Focused. Work-related. And slowly, over time, the space between them returned. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. Because the lesson had already settled where it mattered. That night, as she turned off the lights and prepared to go to bed, she paused for a moment. Not because something was wrong, but because something had been understood. Marriage wasn't just built on love. Or history. Time. It was built on awareness. On the ability to see what the other person might not. On the willingness to listen, even when it felt unnecessary. And most importantly, on the understanding that sometimes, the quietest warnings mattered the most. She had almost missed that. But not entirely. And this time, that was enough.